Cecilia Mata-Obisi, and I am the regional chapter head for ANDI Southern Africa. ANDI, if you are aware of us or if you're not, ANDI stands for the Aspen Network of Development Entrepreneurs. We are a global network of organizations that work to strengthen the entrepreneurship ecosystem. In one way or another, our members are working across the globe to capacitate entrepreneurs, to help them access finance, to help them connect with other organizations and businesses, and to really grow and expand in the work that they do. Our job as ANDI is to try to make the system around them work better, be smoother, just to try to find, the challenges that limit them from growth and try to unravel those through good conversation, through discussion of solutions, through those problems, and also maybe even testing out some ways and some theories to see if they could actually work as practical and evidence-based solutions and hand them back to the ecosystem for implementation. And where possible, we try as much as possible to gather from the learnings of all of our different members and all of our different partners and use that evidence to advocate for more support into the entrepreneurship space. So whether that comes in as funding, that maybe organizations are now more motivated to give into the entrepreneurship space because they have seen evidence of how it works when it works, or whether that means that more organizations come together to collaborate better, to make sure that the work that they're doing is not duplicating, but rather complementing. So that is who ANDI is. We are, because of that, we're always excited to jump onto a juicy bone of policy, and so we saw the opportunity with the G20 coming to South Africa as a prime opportunity for us to have good and in-depth discussions around entrepreneurship once again. As you already know, the G20 has 13 engagement groups, and of those engagement groups, we now, as of 3 years ago, thanks to the work done by the G20 presidency in India, we now have an engagement group that is dedicated to startups. But as the presidency came to South Africa made it made it imperative to also include into the conversations SMMEs, not just startups, but across the whole spectrum of growth of small and medium-sized businesses. So, linked to that, we then took from that page and said, yes, well, that's great that we now have an engagement group just for us. We feel very special. But the reality is the conversation around entrepreneurship, it spans all 13 engagement groups. We can have a conversation about entrepreneurship. We should be having a conversation about entrepreneurship, about small businesses, yes, in the startup space, but also in the social space, also in the youth space, also in the women's space, also in the climate space. Across the board, there is definitely, space to have a conversation about small businesses. And as we know, of course, in the business space, that also matters. So, with that in mind, we created this learning series, which is the G20, the ANDI G20 Entrepreneurship Learning Series. And what we are really looking to do is to facilitate these conversations very specifically around entrepreneurship across 4 different engagement groups. We initially thought about all 13, but there are not enough months in the calendar year. And so we went with 4 engagement groups. And so we started with Youth 20. We had in this very room really interesting conversations around how youth can actually get involved in developing policy that affects them as young businesses. We then had a conversation around Women 20. And in this very room, which happened to be right at the beginning of Women's Month, we had a room full of women that were having a conversation around, okay, so how do we access finance, and how do we, start, unraveling the knot around financial inclusion and access to finance and education for women-led businesses that exists not just in urban areas, but also in rural areas. Then we moved on and had again in this room, gathered a number of different stakeholders to talk about Startup 20 specifically. And there we thought, let's take it a step beyond that and think more ecosystem. And then we gave ourselves permission to imagine the various ecosystems that exist across the world, not just in Africa, and certainly beyond South Africa. So if we're looking at an economy that is growing, or if we're looking at an economy that is mostly local, what does entrepreneurship look like in those spaces, and what should we be solving for from a policy perspective? And so now today, I think, I would love for all of us to be infused by the auras of the discussions that have happened in this room from all those 3 discussions, as we now have today a conversation around business. And how do we create those links between small businesses and large corporates? How do we make sure that those links are sustainable, that they are mutually beneficial? And how do we also become more intentional about recognizing and including not just a business that is small, but a business that is small in a rural area, in a township area. Township economies, we've been having this conversation, and township economies are incredibly important, certainly not just for South Africa, but essentially these peripheral urban economies exist in all of the global South. So how do we make sure, and so much is happening in those spaces, how do we make sure that there is a tangible conversation and engagement that is happening, and that is happening both ways? So that is what today's conversation is about, and we're super excited to have you in the room for it. We appreciate your time, and so I also want to make sure that I introduce the different organizations that have been supporting us. So for each one of these organizations, we bring on not just, we first bring on a member, one of an ANDI member, to lead the discussion, and particularly a ANDI member that is knee-deep in it, elbow-deep in it, that has been working through it. So as we have done with all the other ones, today's member that is leading the discussion is Entrepreneurship to the Point. Many of you are already familiar with them because you have been working with them. In fact, we ask our members and say, all that we are doing is bringing a room. You guys bring the people. Make sure that the people that should be having these conversations is in the room. So Entrepreneurship to the Point is going to be leading us today and taking us through the different conversations. But this particular session would not have been possible without the support of our sponsors. And in particular for this one, we are sponsored by the Walmart Foundation through a program that the Walmart Foundation is partnered with ANDI as well as with AMI for implementation, called the Cassipreneur Program, which, as you can guess from the name, is precisely a program around Cassipreneurs, around entrepreneurship in townships. And also what we also are going to be doing today, we're not going to be sitting in here all day. We're going to be sitting in here to set up the context for our conversation. Then after that, we will be releasing you into the beautiful fresh air so that you can find a spot, sit down, and have a conversation out there before we come back in and just share our collective thoughts. And the whole idea of this, if you're wondering what for though, in the end, we are going to be capturing the recommendations that you are going to be sharing, that you're going to be coming up with. We will be capturing those, and we as ANDI are going to make it a point, with the support of ETTP, who's going to be, putting them together as part of our report. We are then going to make it a point to deliver them to the respective engagement groups, so the B20, with these recommendations. We're also going to be annexing to them the recommendations that have come from all the other conversations that we've had in this room, as well as the conversations that we're having outside of this room. So yesterday, for example, a similar conversation, but around Startup 20, happened in Mozambique, bringing in the perspectives from that space. Earlier this year, a similar conversation around Youth 20 happened in Bangladesh, bringing in those perspectives. And our intention is to say, yes, it is a South African presidency, but the recommendations must be universal, and we're making sure that that's the case with our recommendations. All right, now, properly, please welcome Sean.
Feels so empty when I'm standing here with no podium or anything else. But guys, good morning. Good to see you. Sean Tiernison here from Entrepreneurship to the Point. And I think one of the elements that Celia might have touched on in terms of taking away some of these insights is that we will be taking these insights as well to the ANDI Global Conference. and sharing it more from a kind of global perspective. And I think that's what the benefit that Andy is able to bring to the table, because it's not just looking at it from a country perspective, a regional perspective, but very much from a global South perspective, looking at all the emerging markets. And I'm doing the Andy punt because I also serve as the chair for the Andy Global Steering Committee. And the ability to be able to have these conversations around small and growing businesses and the impact that they have becomes quite critical. So this morning we'll be unpacking kind of social procurement. And when we look at social procurement, we very much say it's a systemic or systematic lever to be able to incorporate inclusive growth. What does that really mean? It means that when I speak about social procurement, or when I speak about social enterprise in an emerging market context, it's about small and growing businesses being able to get a foothold into mainstream private sector. How are we able to incorporate these businesses into supply chain opportunities that is able to lever and provide that impact that is needed? And that impact that's needed from an emerging market perspective is inclusive growth. We need economic growth in South Africa. If we look at some of the numbers that have been released recently, it's not looking that great. Some of the main sectors, like for instance construction, is down by 0.3% in terms of growth. But if you stimulate small businesses within that sector, you are able to activate greater economic opportunity. So that creates job opportunities. But just changing the narrative and changing the thinking as well, because procurement in its own right is an untapped channel for impact. Typically, when we speak about it from a private sector perspective, there's either philanthropic giving or kind of CSI and CSR, but we don't look at the potential that the supply chain actually has, the procurement has, in order to drive impact. And that's the narrative that we want to be able to change. We want to be able to say, how do we take the view that the inclusion of social or social enterprises or small and growing businesses really what impact can they make in terms of economic growth, in terms of inclusive growth within a country, but also in terms of impact, both from an employment opportunity, from a gender opportunity, from a youth opportunity, all those indicators that we kind of lacking on. And those are some of the elements that we want to be able to unpack this morning. We will also look at it very systematically from what's the global picture, what's happening from a global perspective, what's happening from an SA perspective. But more importantly, if we take that and look at it from a kind of more township or rural perspective, the inclusive growth that needs to happen at that lever becomes quite critical. We're going to zone into some of the work that we've done through one of our other programs that we run, Property Point, in terms of local economic development and how that becomes critical as small businesses within regional settings getting included into those supply chain opportunities makes a huge impact, not just in terms of those communities and job creation, but in terms of really growing alongside private sector. So that's what we will be unpacking a little bit today. And on that note, just to give you a bit of an overview around the agenda, I think I've kind of shaped it already. We're going to be gathering your insights, your perspectives around it. How are you able to add, whether you're a small business, whether you're a policy maker, whether you're a private sector stakeholder in the room today. I think what we try to do is make sure that we gather different perspectives, but also different stakeholders in the room in order to add to the insights of this conversation. And Desigan will be joining a bit later to be able to take us through a bit of a workshop format of how to unpack and unlock and get your insights on these elements and really look at some of the key solutions that needs to be driving this. And I think what's appropriate for us is that through the work that EDP has been doing within the region over the past 15 plus years, it's always been around how do we focus on inclusion into value chains, inclusion into opportunities, integration of that small and growing businesses into. You cannot develop small businesses outside of the context of the market and market opportunities. If private sector is not alongside you as a key partner, the level of impact that you're going to drive is not going to be there. And I guess we've done exceptionally well within that space. So just a quick introduction, entrepreneurship to the point. We kind of focus around really looking at economic inclusion with small and growing businesses at the core of it, and how we're able to unpack and unlock opportunities within a broader ecosystem. If you are not able to focus on driving the support, the capacitation, the integration of small businesses, you're not going to unlock economic opportunity. And that's really our view. And as an organization, we really focus around the continent, how we're able to really make a difference. If we look at some of the literature or what it said, Africa is the next forefront, but it's up to us as Africans to say, how do we shape those strategies for inclusive growth and not have it kind of put on us. So very much a strong advocate for being able for us to drive the change that we need to see in the continent ourselves. Our offerings, some of our clients are in the room, which is very thankful to them, but we have a strong focus around kind of research and impact, evidence-based development, evidence-based impact. Are we able to take what the theory says, the practice says, and provide the level of insights to the market? We've partnered up with Andy, both in East Africa, West Africa, and Southern Africa, to be able to develop a lot of kind of research outputs. It's available on our websites. We also provide support in terms of entrepreneurship development programs. One of our flagship programs that we manage in South Africa is Property Point, but also alongside that, working in the mining sector, in the ICT sector, and very much across other ecosystems within the region. We have an entrepreneurship engagement platform, being able to provide entrepreneurs with the necessary opportunities, insights, and just expertise, information. Our tagline there is very much we want to be able to inform, equip, and inspire entrepreneurs in order to take their business to the next level. So follow us on the socials. Monthly, we have these type of sessions in Johannesburg and in Cape Town. Then also ecosystem building and partnerships. How do we become that kind of, how do we partner up with ecosystems players to be able to become catalytic in the support of small businesses and build the broader entrepreneurship ecosystems? Just a kind of footprint, very much a Southern Africa, East Africa, West Africa footprint in terms of the work that we have done over the years, and open for business. There we go. So the objectives for the session is really to look at the current state of social procurement. Like we said, if we look at some of the numbers, procurement is a huge channel in terms of transactional value within a market. How are you able to effectively steer that in a way that drives impact? A lot of the work that we've done in some of the kind of emerging markets is that when you're looking, for instance, at, say, broader, large-scale economic development, you have development funding coming in, or you have foreign aid coming in. Typically, they earmark that on the basis that they want to drive infrastructure development. But if the system is broken, what typically happens in these public-private partnerships is you have multinational supply chains coming in, you kind of keep focus around cost, resources, and efficiency. We've seen it. You go to Zambia, Parliament was built by the Chinese. You go to Kenya, the highway was built by the Chinese. So you have all this kind of multinational funding or foreign aid coming in, but what happens is that you are actually excluding your local operators. So the inclusion of your local business network and ecosystems becomes quite critical. So we want to be able to say, how are we able to shift that narrative to really focus on it? And maybe the question today is also, is social procurement the right tagline for this? Because everything social sometimes gives people a very different connotation, as opposed to looking at inclusive procurement or impact procurement. Maybe that's part of the narrative that needs to change. Second objective, and there we're going to look at what's happening from a global perspective. The Schwab Foundation, World Economic Forum has done quite a bit of research within that space, an essay perspective, but also what is happening on the ground. If we look at the Walmart project and the Casipreneur project that's currently going on, it's about how do we stimulate that local township businesses to become integrators into the economy, explore potential solution that enables social procurement to be a strategic lever. So that's your insights. We're going to gather your thoughts, insights around how that is actually possible, and what are some of the viewpoints based on your engagement, your periphery in the market that will allow us to shape new solutions and then generate actionable recommendations to be able to put forward both from a B20 and a G20 perspective, but as I mentioned, to take this on a global stage at our upcoming Andy conference in 2 weeks' time, where we're able to really engage at a broader discussion from an emerging market perspective. So what are some of what's the global environment? So let's take it up a bit further. And I think over the past 5 years, this has become actually quite evident. COVID was a real opportunity for us to really understand how global markets work. Because one of the biggest challenges that came out of COVID was global supply chains being cut down. And the countries needed to focus on inclusive growth and inclusive procurement. You know, that meant that you were not necessarily getting what you needed to get within the market. It's a fascinating play in terms of if we look at South Africa, say for instance, from an agriculture perspective. I recently had some discussions with some importers that were looking at procuring agriculture produce from South Africa. So South Africa is a great producer of agriculture, but a lot of that also gets exported. It does not get left for internal consumption. There was a drought in Turkey and the Mesopotamia region, and they did not have any, they didn't have access to any citrus. And so it became a bit of a citrus shortage. And they needed to come and find markets where they're able to export. But what actually took place is that a lot of that export that we have available in South Africa is already earmarked for somewhere else. So your ability to be a producer is critical, but that production also does not necessarily always benefit your internal market. It benefits your external market. But if you have big shifts, for instance, like a COVID that cuts off those markets, you would then have an oversupply within the South African context. Your local consumption would not be there, and that means almost the death of an industry in a sense. And that's what we saw in terms of what happened within a COVID environment. You also have a high rise of inequality. We saw the Ukraine war and what that meant in terms of the impact of just the socioeconomic factors within the country outside of the procurement space. So now you have the larger need within those markets for certain goods, and you're not able to get there. Inequality is rising. You have climate change as a huge driver to changing how markets operate and what is needed at which time and point in time. So all these things, geopolitical unrest, if we look at the dynamics that's happening both from a West perspective, so think around what Trump has put in place with kind of import tariffs, what that impact meant both, especially for South Africa. It had it's having a huge impact around how our small businesses that feed into that value chain is actually able to create more profitability. So that geopolitical shift becomes something that has a huge impact on how businesses get run. And these things are important for you as a small business. You are not oblivious to what happens on a global stage on your business, because that means it has there's a trickle-down effect, but it has an impact on how you operate. We saw how that exposed the vulnerabilities within supply chains, but it created the opportunity. And once again, if we look at it from an Africa perspective, one of the biggest drivers that we need to drive is how do we focus inclusive growth on the continent. Great policies in place. The Africa Free Trade Agreement area is great from a theoretical perspective, but the practical applications around how it needs to be implemented to make sense on the ground whether that means how do we remove interborder trade, how do we remove visa restrictions, how do we look at logistical solutions to engage these different markets, needs to be something that's worked on in order to be able to stimulate that kind of inter-regional trade. Second element is if we then look at it from a corporate driver. And this is slightly different if we look at it from a US perspective, because the US has almost gone the opposite when we're speaking about kind of ESG, environmental, social, and governance drivers. Whereas in kind of European perspective, it's something that is a key driver. So as a small business, how are you aligning yourself to the kind of some of the objectives of driving an ESG agenda? What's your impact from an environmental and social and governance perspective? What is the impact that you are driving from a kind of SDG perspective? We're working, for instance, alongside the ILO at the moment around SGB, is it 8? Decent work implementation. Is it right? Yes. I got my SGBs right at least. To drive decent work within supply chains. These are all drivers that aligns to what's going to make the economy more inclusive. So as a small business, what is the dynamics that's happening from a private sector agenda perspective? How are you able to align to that and also link back into it? One of the companies that we have today as well, waste management company, huge space at the moment. And not just from a South African perspective, but also from an African perspective, because the ability to ensure that we are driving strategic solutions, for instance, in waste, that drives both an environmental impact, but also a huge kind of social impact, becomes critical to unlocking what's happening within that space. And then I think 3 on the global perspective is looking at public procurement to really leverage the market. South Africa has done that well. We have regulations in place to be able to say, okay, how do we support, for instance, we have our BEE legislation and we have kind of CSR objectives, but we're not alone. If we look at some of our African countries, they are similar in terms of local procurement. We look at India as an example, a huge driver in terms of CSR objectives, where each private sector company needs to also spend at least 1% of their net profit after tax towards social impact. But how are we able to drive that to be more strategic? Because I think we can easily, if I say corporate social investment or CSI, the mindset is slightly different to saying, okay, we need to drive initiatives that's going to create economic inclusion. You know, we typically think about this as the social do-good things. But we need to shift that narrative around saying, how does social spend equate into impact and economic inclusion? So that becomes critical. Then if we unpack this from a South African perspective, just a broader global perspective, some of the numbers, we're talking about your procurement spend far exceeding your philanthropic spend. So that becomes a huge opportunity to be able to really unpack what is needed in the marketplace. So your FTSE CSR budgets comes in at about $12 million, whereas your procurement spend is in the billions. So it's a totally different indicator that you can use and saying, okay, what is the social impact of that $5 billion spend? As opposed to saying, okay, what's happening from a CSR perspective? What lives do we impact? So changing that narrative, looking at scale and the potential of that scale becomes quite critical. The Schwab Foundation, in terms of some of the work that they've done, says that there's most probably about 10 million social enterprises that creates over $2 trillion of annual revenue. That adds 2 million jobs into the broader marketplace, which is quite critical. Your social procurement needs to be business as usual with the focus on social impact. You know, it's once again just changing that narrative around it. So not just procurement for the sake of a compliance function. We're seeing from a private sector perspective that function of strategic procurement to look at how it integrates from an ESG perspective. What's the SG, sustainable development goals that it actually has an impact on becomes quite critical. So there's also part of the kind of challenges within this global market is that there is then a huge funding gap. So small suppliers face barriers to scale in meeting the corporate compliance. So the support for small businesses becomes so critical. And this is where the work that Andy advocates for, the work that ETTP or that does becomes critical, because supporting your small and growing business ecosystem as an enabler for this economic growth is critical. Hence the fact that it should not necessarily, and also from a South African perspective, guys, we should change the mindset. It's not just around BEE compliance, but it's really around how do we utilize what is in place in the marketplace to create inclusive growth. So your role as small businesses is not to get any corporate BE certificates. Your growth, your objective is how am I able to drive the needed access to market and access to impact that is needed. What is it? Jobs for youth, gender objectives, the exclusion of women out of the economy, township economies. How do we stimulate that economic opportunities? And township in a sense that needs to be a little bit broader in my opinion as well. It's not township as we understand it. It should be township and rural opportunities. This weekend I was away in a bit of a farming town, and you realize when you're going out into this kind of more rural-based settings, those rural communities, the level of unemployment, lack of access to opportunities is huge. So how are we changing that perspective? And the challenge, there's two challenges I've put out. One is, do we call it social procurement? And the second challenge is, let's change the narrative around just speaking around township, because township in our mindset is more urban setting, outlying urban settings because of geopolitical reasoning in South Africa. But outlying, so township and rural needs to become critical in that discussion. So the global state of procurement, if we look at and unpack it from a different sector perspective, you're finding that, let's use Walmart as an example. They have a reliance on small-scale producers to be able to feed into their supply chain in order to be able to provide the goods that's needed. How do you create and facilitate that within that market? How does the introduction of Walmart within South Africa now going to start stimulating local producers to have access point? And so sourcing, making sure that they're able to partner up in order to develop small businesses that's going to be able to